had been with Tyler for 3 years, and for most of that time, things were good. He was charming, attentive, and made me feel like the center of his world. But over the past year, his behavior started to change. He became possessive, constantly questioning where I was, who I was with, and even monitoring my social media. It was exhausting. I knew it was time to end things, but Tyler didn't take the breakup well. He begged, pleaded, and promised to change. When I didn't relent, he showed up at my workplace with flowers, made a scene, and embarrassed me in front of my coworkers. I tried to stay firm, but he wasn't giving up. Then, he proposed something I foolishly agreed to. One last weekend trip together to end things on good terms. He promised it would be platonic, just two people saying goodbye to their time together. Against my better judgment, I said yes. Tyler suggested a cabin up in the mountains, far from the city. He said it was a peaceful spot, and he wanted me to remember him positively. The drive up was awkward. He tried to joke around like old times, but I mostly stared out the window, counting the hours until the trip would be over. The further we drove, the more uneasy I felt. The roads became narrower, and cell phone service disappeared completely. When we finally arrived, the cabin was smaller than I expected and tucked deep into the woods. It looked rustic, no electricity, just a wood stove for heat and lanterns for light. The isolation hit me like a punch to the gut, but I told myself I could endure a couple of nights. Tyler seemed calm, even cheerful, as he unpacked. The first night passed uneventfully. We cooked over the fire pit outside, and for a moment it almost felt like old times. But every time I tried to bring up the future, how we'd move on and start fresh separately, he'd deflect, changing the subject or steering the conversation back to happier memories. Something felt off. The second night is when everything spiraled. After dinner, Tyler suggested we go for a walk to clear our heads. I didn't want to, but the way he looked at me, his eyes intense and expectant, made me feel like I didn't have a choice. We walked in silence, the only sounds coming from the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional rustle of trees in the wind. Suddenly, Tyler stopped. "Do you think we could ever be together again?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm. I hesitated, knowing my answer would upset him. "Tyler, we've talked about this. I think it's better if we go our separate ways." His expression darkened. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice rising. "I'm not letting you go. I brought you here so we could fix this." I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking, but the look on his face sent chills down my spine. He grabbed my wrist, his grip so tight it hurt. "You're not leaving me," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Not this time." Panic set in. I yanked my arm away and bolted, running blindly through the woods. I could hear Tyler shouting behind me, calling my name, his voice echoing through the trees. I tripped over roots and stumbled in the darkness, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had no idea where I was going. I just needed to get away. I found a cluster of thick bushes and crouched down, trying to quiet my breathing. My heart pounded as I heard Tyler's footsteps crunching closer. "You can't hide from me," he called out, his voice chillingly casual. "I know these woods better than you do." I stayed as still as possible, praying he wouldn't find me. After what felt like an eternity, his footsteps faded. I waited until I was sure he was gone before carefully making my way back toward the cabin. I didn't know where else to go, and I needed to grab my phone and car keys. When I reached the cabin, it was eerily quiet. I crept inside, my hands trembling as I searched for my keys. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My phone was gone, and so were my car keys. Tyler had taken them. The front door slammed shut behind me, and I spun around to see him standing there, blocking the exit. "You thought you could leave me?" he asked, his face a mask of fury. "You don't get to decide when this ends. I do." Desperation took over. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a cast iron skillet from the stove, and swung it at him with all my strength. It hit him square in the head, and he crumpled to the floor. I didn't wait to see if he was unconscious. I grabbed my jacket and ran out the door. I ran until I saw headlights in the distance. A passing car slowed when the driver saw me, and I waved them down, sobbing, as I explained what had happened. They called the police, who arrived within an hour. When they went back to the cabin, Tyler was gone. He had fled, leaving behind my phone and keys. The police took me back to town, where I filed a restraining order against Tyler. I moved in with a friend, temporarily, terrified he might show up at my apartment. Months later, I learned he had been arrested for stalking another ex-girlfriend. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't escaped that night, but I've never gone anywhere alone with someone I don't trust. Again. I met Olivia through a mutual friend, and at first, everything was great. She was fun, spontaneous, and incredibly affectionate. Maybe a little too affectionate. She wanted to be with me all the time, which I initially brushed off as her just being really into me. But after about 3 months, her behavior started to get weird. She'd show up at my apartment unannounced, even when I told her I was busy. If I didn't answer her texts immediately, she'd call me over and over until I picked up. And when I hung out with my friends, especially any female friends, she'd throw a fit, accusing me of cheating. I tried to reason with her, but Olivia didn't take criticism well. Every argument turned into a meltdown, with her crying, begging me not to leave her, and promising to do better. I stayed for another 3 months, hoping she'd change, but it only got worse. She started tracking my location, saying it was just so she didn't have to worry. She knew things about my schedule that I had never told her. And then she started hinting at us moving in together, even though I hadn't even hinted at that. That was the final straw. When I broke up with her, she lost it. She screamed, threw things, and threatened to ruin my life if I ever moved on. I blocked her on everything and figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A few months later, I started dating a girl named Emma. She was the opposite of Olivia, calm, understanding, and not obsessive. It was refreshing to be with someone normal. But after about a month of dating, Emma started getting weird messages on social media from fake accounts. At first, they were just vague insults, but then they escalated. "Stay away from him. He doesn't love you. You're just a placeholder." We both knew it was Olivia. I told Emma to ignore it, but then Olivia started showing up. One night, we were out at dinner when Emma suddenly tensed up. "She's here," she whispered. I turned around, and sure enough, Olivia was sitting alone at a table a few feet away, just staring at us. She wasn't eating, wasn't drinking, just watching. When I made eye contact, she smirked and casually stood up, walking out as if nothing happened. I was pissed. I confronted her over text. I had briefly unblocked her, telling her to leave us alone. Her response chilled me. "You don't get to replace me. You were mine first." I blocked her again, but she kept finding ways to insert herself into my life. She followed Emma to work once, just to see what she was like. Emma came home shaken, saying Olivia had stood outside her workplace for hours, without ever going inside. Then, one night, Emma found a note taped to her apartment door. "I can't let you have him. You don't deserve him." At that point, we decided to file a restraining order. I didn't think Olivia would actually do anything, but I wanted legal documentation in case she escalated. And then she did. One night, I was leaving work late. I walked to my car in the empty parking lot when I suddenly heard footsteps rushing up behind me. Before I could react, something sharp jabbed into my side. "Get in the car," a voice whispered. "Olivia." I froze. She was holding a knife against my ribs, her breathing ragged. "Olivia, what the hell are you doing?" I said, trying to stay calm. "You were supposed to love me," she muttered. "We were supposed to be together forever. I just need to remind you." She motioned toward her car, parked a few feet away. I knew I had to act fast. Olivia was smaller than me, and while she had a knife, she wasn't exactly a trained kidnapper. The second she eased up her grip to open her car door, I shoved her, hard. She stumbled back, and I ran. She lunged at me again, but I was faster. I grabbed her wrist, twisted the knife out of her hand, and pinned her to the pavement. She thrashed and screamed, but I held her down while I called 911. The police arrived minutes later. She was still wailing when they cuffed her, sobbing about how I was supposed to be hers. That was the last time I ever saw Olivia. She was charged with attempted kidnapping and aggravated assault, and since she had already been reported for stalking Emma, the judge didn't go easy on her. She got sentenced to a few years in prison, and we were granted permanent restraining orders. To this day, I still check my surroundings when I walk to my car at night, because if Olivia was willing to go that far once, I have no doubt she'd do it again. I never expected to be back in my hometown for anything other than holidays, but my mom insisted on throwing me a bridal shower with all of my relatives. It had been 4 years since I left for college, and even though I loved where I grew up, I knew I had outgrown it. I had big dreams, ones that didn't involve staying in the same town I was born and raised in. My high school boyfriend, Ethan, didn't feel the same way. He had always been content staying here, working for his dad's construction company and settling down with a family just like his parents had done. When I told him I was going to college across the country, he tried to be supportive at first. But as the months passed, he grew bitter, and eventually, we both knew what had to happen. We ended things amicably, or so I thought. Fast forward 4 years, and I was back in town for the bridal shower my mom had planned. It was meant to be a short visit, just a weekend, but my friends convinced me to go out for drinks at the only bar in town. It was a Saturday night, and the place was packed with familiar faces. Everyone wanted to congratulate me, ask about my fiancé, and hear about my life in the city. I was standing by the bar, drink in hand, laughing with my best friend when I heard someone say my name. "Lena?" I turned and felt my stomach drop slightly. It was Ethan. He looked almost exactly the same, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing his signature worn-out ball cap. But there was something different about his eyes. "Ethan, hey," I said, trying to sound as normal as possible. He pulled me into a brief hug, and for a moment, it felt like no time had passed at all. We started catching up, and I told him about my life, how I'd graduated, started a career, and met an amazing guy. At first, he seemed happy for me, nodding along and asking questions. But when I mentioned my engagement, his entire demeanor shifted. He got quiet, took a step back, and muttered something under his breath before walking away without another word. I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to let it ruin my night. I went back to my friends, shaking off the weirdness and focusing on enjoying myself. As the night went on, I noticed Ethan drinking heavily. He was throwing back shots with some guys he used to hang out with in high school, his laughter growing louder, more erratic. I told myself it was fine. He was probably just blowing off steam. That was until I went to the bathroom. I had just finished washing my hands when I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, and there he was, blocking my path. "You really left, huh?" His words were slurred, but his eyes were locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Ethan, you're drunk," I said, keeping my voice even. "Let's just go back to the bar." He didn't move. "I waited for you," he said, his voice trembling with something between anger and sadness. "4 years, Lena. I didn't date anyone. I didn't even look at another girl. I knew you'd come back." My stomach twisted into a knot. "Ethan, how could you get engaged to some guy who doesn't even love you half as much as I do?" He spat, stepping closer. I took a step back, my heart racing. "Ethan, this isn't..." Before I could finish, he grabbed my arm. I yanked away, but he was strong. Panic surged through me as I tried to shove past him, but he pushed me back, and I lost my footing, falling to the ground with a sharp gasp. The second I hit the floor, I let out a scream. The noise must have carried over the music because, within seconds, people were rushing into the hallway. I barely had time to process what was happening before hands were pulling Ethan off me, dragging him toward the exit. "You were supposed to be mine," he shouted, his voice breaking as they shoved him out the door. I sat there, shaken, my hands trembling as my friends helped me to my feet. The bartender called the cops, but by the time they arrived, Ethan was long gone. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, my mind replaying everything over and over. I never thought Ethan would be the type of guy to lose control like that. But looking back, maybe I had ignored the signs. Maybe I had underestimated just how deeply his feelings for me had run. I left town the next day and never looked back. Thanks so much for listening to Nightmare Narratives. We hope you enjoyed these truly terrifying stories. If you did, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you'll know when we post new videos every Tuesday and Friday at 10 a.m. Central Time. If you have a scary story you'd like to hear read on the channel, email us at officialnightmarenarratives@gmail.com, and you might just hear your story in a future episode. Thanks again for listening, and stay spooky, friends. We'll catch you in the next one.